Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Are Your Video Calls Secure? My name is Bill Chamberlain, and in addition to being today's host, I lead the global sales and marketing teams here at Verrex. Today's webinar will be the first in a series that we are looking to produce. In today's current environment, most of our clients, including Verrex ourselves, are navigating our new remote workplace while maintaining the security that business still requires. On today's webinar, we are going to share our insights and best practices on video conferencing and security. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Joining us from Hong Kong is Paul Cullen, Verrex's Director of Asia Pacific. Paul has tremendous experience, including having previously worked in combat zones throughout the world to ensure military, government organizations, and embassies had access to secure voice and video communications. When you connect with Paul on LinkedIn, you'll see his other impressive corporate experience in over 12 years with casinos in Macau. Good evening, Paul, and thanks for joining us.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you, Bill.
Next, I'd like to introduce Brian Mcgrogan, Verrex's Senior Systems Programmer and Network Systems Engineer. Whew, long title, but that doesn't even start to describe the 19 years of experience he has in the Pro AV industry, including the highest levels of system programming certifications. Brian is our network AV, IT, and UC specialist, delivering complex and powerful solutions for many of our Global 500 clients. When we need our AV systems to integrate seamlessly with other IT infrastructures, Brian is our go-to guy. Welcome, Brian, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Good morning.
And last but certainly not least, our moderator for today's session, Ben Dandola-Grubb, Verrex's Assistant Vice President of Engineering Services. With a degree in electrical engineering and over 20 years of Pro AV experience, Ben understands the intricacies of AV systems and their interoperability. Ben is our technical expert and guru. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Bill.
All right, before I turn it call over to Ben, a few administrative details. First, we're recording today's session and we'll make a replay available afterwards. Also, there will be a Q&A period towards the end of the webinar. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions. If we don't get a chance to answer the question during the session, someone will personally reach out afterwards. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ben.
Excellent, thank you. Let's get started here. So let's just run through our agenda of what we're going to accomplish this morning. We first need to define security as it relates to video conferencing in our corporate environment. We're going to talk through our typical behaviors as it relates to security and what you expect to happen and versus what you don't want to happen. Run through what some of the primary or popular conferencing platforms are that we all use on pretty much a daily basis. We're going to talk through some of the recent security issues that we've all seen in the news in the past 2 months or so since we've been primarily working from home. And then we need to talk through ease of use and balancing that with security and where we're going to lie in the middle there, because what you do may be different than what I do because it's going to be based on your needs and your types of meetings and who you're talking to. We're going to run through best practices, what you should do to help keep your meetings secure. And as Bill mentioned, we'll have time for questions at the end of our conversation here. So let's roll right in. Paul, would you give us the highlights of what security is to kick us off here?
Yeah, sure. So in a word, it's about privacy. It's the privacy of our data, in this case, video conferencing data, our conversations. But it's also about the metadata. So the metadata is the data which goes along with the conversation. It's about who calls who, for how long and how often. And it's often the metadata which is more important than the actual conversation itself. And who are we trying to keep that private from? We're trying to keep it private from what we call in security bad actors. Bad actors can be government organizations, foreign or domestic. That's at the one extreme. In the middle, we have corporates corporate companies who are just trying to gain a competitive advantage by maybe taking the information that you have. We also have criminals and scammers in the middle range there. And then on the low level, we have hackers, just sort of jerks, just wanting kicks and giggles who want to disrupt your meeting. But to achieve security, there's 3 things we have to do. And if you achieve these 3 things, then you're on your way to securing your data. And that's first, you must keep your data confidential. Number 2 would be you need to authenticate the users. And number three, we've got to ensure that our messages stay complete. The integrity of the message isn't interrupted.
That sounds good. And let's get into some details. So Brian, would you provide a little information about confidentiality?
Absolutely, Ben. So confidentiality really is stripping off any identifying information, right? As Paul said, in a lot of cases, the metadata around the meeting itself is actually almost more important to a lot of companies or individuals. So stripping that off and making sure that everything there is generic. And then when you look at authentication, it's really about verifying that you are who you say you are from the sending side. And then the receiver is also who you expect that to be. So verifying and authenticating both sides of that.
So I'm really Ben and you're really Brian.
Correct. Yep, we are. Exactly. And then message integrity is making sure that the data of the actual message is not changed or not manipulated anywhere in the path between you or myself. So that message is exactly the same on your side as it is on my side. And then all three of these together, looking at each aspect of it, is what helps us identify a security mindset and helps us get into that frame of mind.
So I think that from my own perspective, in a traditional sense, the AV industry has been poor or maybe even terrible when it comes to security. From a personal note, I like things fast. I'm not very patient. So I just want my meeting to start. I don't really want to be bothered with a password. It's just annoying, but maybe that's not the way I should be thinking about this. Paul, what is a security mindset related to conferencing?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Ben. As an industry, AV is way behind the curve of, say, the telecommunications industry or the IT industry. So the mindset, I mean, it's about, first of all, setting your own privacy expectations. Right now, there is no expectations of any privacy in the conversation that we're having. In fact, the opposite. We want this conversation to be open. But if I was to have a conversation with an employee, perhaps one-on-one, giving an appraisal, then you would expect some sort of privacy. So you've got to set your privacy expectations. You do that by asking a few questions. And also remembering a few mantras. So there is no secure shortcut. So if you are using a platform which allows you to go straight into a meeting as a shortcut, that's also inherent in that is a security risk. Remember the old phrase that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Value your own data, value your conversations. Think to yourself before you have the conversation, is this a conversation that I need to keep private? And if it is, then you start adopting some of the measures that we'll be talking about later. Just stop and think. As a general rule, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And we all know this. We pay for cable so we don't have to watch the adverts. In the world of video conferencing, it is no different. You get what you pay for. Once you set your privacy expectations, you're ready to try and implement them with policies as well as software.
And Brian, do you have anything additional to add to the security mindset here?
Yeah, I do. So I think one of the big things that we need to pay attention to here is you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? And in a lot of scenarios, the human factor is actually the weakest link, right? I could accidentally send my invite to the wrong person. I could forward something along because, as you said, Ben, I'm used to these shortcuts. I want things to be fast. I start to type in your name. It autofills. I hit enter and send it off. And, oh, hold on, that went to the wrong Ben. So we just need to be careful about what we're doing. Stop for just a moment, review, think, and make sure that we don't actually cause an unintentional data breach.
So it sounds like that's a bigger issue than potentially just conferencing. As you said, I've had the same experience where I have to pay attention to potentially where my cursor is when I'm sending an email.
Yeah, absolutely. You can, or type in the wrong chat, type in the wrong email. It just takes us a moment to stop, breathe, check what we're about to do, and then move forward.
And so maybe it says also, don't type something and don't say something that you don't want a few other people to hear, in case you were personally making a mistake, regardless of the bad actors that Paul was talking about before.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul touched on it for a moment too, right? There are certain conversations that maybe are best in person still. So we just need to think about that as well.
Yep, that's all makes sense. So let's dive into a couple of the platforms. So if we start off by looking at the social media conferencing platforms, which I personally have been using more than ever before because I'm not able to get together with friends and family. You know, from this list here, I guess the most popular one in our house is Google Duo, because that's how we can talk to grandma, or the kids can talk to grandma right now. Some of these platforms are more secure than maybe a commercial conferencing platform, and some of them have absolutely no security whatsoever, but we're all familiar with these apps, and we're probably running them on our phones, on our personal devices right now. Today, though, we're going to focus on the commercial platform aspect here. You can see a bunch of logos on your screen right now. The primary ones that are very popular: Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Cisco WebEx meetings, and also BlueJeans, along with a plethora of other options, are out there. And we're going to be continuing to use these platforms as we roll it into the conversation of unified communications and collaboration. When we talk about the platforms, it's a gigantic industry. You know, depending on what all you include here, we could say it's a $9 to $20 billion industry. And I've read other estimates that say, and this all depends on how much you include, by year 2026, we could be talking close to $170 billion. So this not all strictly AV, because a lot of the IT is rolled into that as well, but we are growing and we need to continue to grow with this. So we are developing our knowledge base and expertise so that we can help roll out systems and platforms for end users everywhere. And so let's get into the details here about the different types of communication. Paul, I want to ask you about this one. Would you give us the overview of how these different calls actually work behind the scenes?
Sure. So what you're seeing on the screen at the moment is just a very simplified version of the two main architectures involved in communications. So you got point-to-point and the cloud-hosted architecture. So the padlocks represent in this picture where the point of encryption is, and that will become important in a minute. So what you want is the encryption as close to the end device as possible. Again, we are oversimplifying things here, and I'll explain a bit more in a minute or two. So on the top, we've got point-to-point system. This would be your traditional sort of hard codec. We would have a device where that padlock is, and that device would be encrypting the data at one end and decrypting it at the other end.
So that sounds fairly secure to me.
Well, it is. It's traditional, but of course, in the way that we work now, this drawing is very simplified, so it looks good on the screen. But in reality, you would have point to multi-point, and so it becomes very complicated because each end user would need its own encryption. So you get, if you've got 10 users, you've got 10 encryption keys. You have 10 encrypted links, and that makes things very, very difficult. In the cloud hosted system, the difference here would be that the inside that cloud would be one or perhaps a number of servers, which would initiate or set up the call, and that would distribute the keys so you can unlock the padlocks, so you can encrypt and decrypt the communication. This becomes problematic because you need to know where those servers are. So when we're talking about the padlocks and encryption, it's important that without getting too technical, there's two different kinds. There's end-to-end encryption, sometimes seen as E2EE, and that's if you understand the 7-layer ISO stack. That's actually running on the application. Okay, so on your phone, it would still be on your phone, but it would be at the application level. That's running on the software itself, the actual video conferencing software you're using. The other kind of encryption, which is still end-to-end as far as device to device, but it's actually running on a lower level, level 4 on the protocol stack. And that's called transport or the service layer encryption. And this is very important because what we want is E2EE encryption if you want to be fully secure, and it's very difficult to get that. But that will ensure that your communication is as secure as it can be.
And then maybe throughout this conversation, since this all sounds kind of technical for me, why don't we dive into the details here to help everyone understand what this really means and how to apply it to what they are doing and how they are conferencing, how they're using platforms. So Paul, I'd like you to dive in, not too much in depth, but the hard codec approach. First off, what is a codec? And then what's a hard codec?
Sure. So codec is just two words amalgamated into one. It means code, decode. The correct terminology is really encoder, decoder. That is a separate box. We probably all know the makes out there. You've got Polycom, you've got Cisco, there's a whole bunch of them. It's a separate box which goes either in the rack or behind the display unit or in the room somewhere. And that is what dials the link or makes the link. Okay. The advantages of that system is that it's more secure. It's more secure because they can run end-to-end encryption. Now, it's important to note that Cisco WebEx, for example, on their codecs, run end-to-end encryption, but it is off as a default. Just to say how bad we are as an industry, we have the tools to make sure things are completely secure. Most of them don't know about them, and they're switched off as default. I mean, why wouldn't you switch those on? Well, you don't switch them. Encryption is very computative intensive, and it takes a lot of processing power. And if you're on a device which perhaps is old, it struggles, and therefore you might get a different user experience depending on what codec you're using. So that's why they're switched off really as a default. But they are generally very stable connections. The devices are purpose made for what they're doing. They're not doing anything else. They're just encoding and decoding your video conferencing. But they do have disadvantages. The disadvantages would be, of course, they're not mobile phones. They are boxes which stay in rooms. So it's not very easy to unplug them and put them in different rooms. They do tend to be more costly. And recently this is changing, but traditionally they've been very difficult to do any cross-platform. So Cisco system found it difficult to call Teams, for example. That has changed recently, but it's a rather recent change.
Thanks, Paul. So Brian, I want to dive into the flip side here with you. Now that we are in what now we're calling a soft codec approach, what is that?
So the soft codec approach, right, is replacing that hardware appliance with whether it be like a room PC or your laptop that you bring into the room, right? So as that soft codec goes, we're no longer going to depend on a dedicated piece of hardware, which means that I no longer have to say, okay, I'm going to buy a box from manufacturer X. Right? I have my laptop, whoever might manufacture that, and I can install whichever codec or whichever piece of software we choose to use. So that offers you some greater flexibility, right? If this year we decide to go with this conferencing provider, and next year for whatever reason we want to transition to another, we have that flexibility without replacing all those boxes. So that is definitely a big advantage. You also have a greater speed of innovation there, right? So if there are application updates that need to be pushed out, that's simply just an installer on your PC, whether that, again, be a PC dedicated to that space, whether that be your laptop itself. You have some more control over that. You work with your IT team, that gets pushed out. So that helps mitigate some of the security issues that can be possible there. So that's definitely helpful. There are also some disadvantages too, and you'll notice that some of them actually overlap from the advantages. So you do have some security issues because you are introducing equipment agnostic, right? So I might not set up my laptop exactly the same way that you do, Ben, right? Which does leave some security holes open there. In a larger organization, that's going to be managed more by the IT team, and we'll get into that. That really, that they can really lock that down, and that does make things more secure. Not being tied to the same provider also can be a disadvantage, right? If I do switch providers in there, instead of the traditional approach of an interface on a panel, et cetera, all of a sudden the user's experience is going to change. So I'm going to have to make sure that my users are trained, which is very important in ensuring that we are secure. And then the speed of innovation, right? Things changing so quickly, that comes right back to training and my user experience, making sure that people understand how to use each platform, and that we're rolling those things out in a smart way.
You also got me thinking there in terms of including that greater speed of innovation on disadvantages. We don't control the app that may be pushed out from Zoom, from Microsoft Teams. And so when they make a change, it will affect, in some cases, the end user experience. And it could range from, oh, this is different, but I figured it out, it's okay, all the way to it's broken. I can't send my computer to the far end of my call today. Hey, technical support, we got a big issue here. What are we going to do?
Absolutely. And, you know, as a programmer, right, I'm not perfect. I make mistakes and there are bugs, right? We try to get through that and we try to test that. And there, you know, at these larger companies, there are huge QA departments that do that. But bugs do make it out there, right? So all of a sudden, if I've rolled that out to, you know, 5,000 employees, that can be a big issue, right? Because nobody caught it and just one person realizes, oh, I use this a little bit differently, and uh-oh, there you go. Yeah. Another item there too, Ben, right, in our traditional approach, because things are dedicated, right, manufacturers are test their hardware, because we've become more agnostic here, there are some challenges integrating to us, like extending USB, different camera types, feeding microphone audio in. So that does become a disadvantage and makes things a little more challenging for us as well.
So as you've talked about IT and software, it does lead me into thinking how we are a partner now with the IT. AV and IT are a partnership, and then we are working together. So what we do is coordinate from the very beginning of a project and talk about whether it's just the certain rooms in this project or the bigger picture holistic approach. It could just be, help me with my strategy for my corporate organization. But Brian, what are some of the things that we do as an organization to help us flow as seamlessly as possible with the device on the network?
So we've been talking about this for years, right? The convergence of AT and IV, or AV and IT. So it really now has become, especially in becoming more agnostic and applications that are installed in PCs instead of dedicated hardware devices, has really become more important now, more than ever, that we really become a partnership with IT, working with them right from the get-go to ensure that they understand what our requirements are and we understand what their requirements are. Right? They may say there's no way you're installing the latest piece of software on here, right? And that's okay. We need to know that up front, and we need to set the right expectations and work with them, right? If we get them involved early in the process, we can understand what they might need from us, and we can help make the best client experience.
So, and vice versa is just as important, right? What do we need from the network?
Absolutely correct. We need to make sure that we have the right information, you know, that we're going to provide them with maybe the IP address scheme or not so much that, but that we need a dedicated VLAN depending on what we're doing, and that we understand the way that the PCs are managed, right? If they push out updates automatically, hopefully they have a development network or development environment where they can roll things out, test them before they go into production, so we can help mitigate some of that all of a sudden change in user experience. Some IT departments actually lock down the USB ports as well, right? They don't want somebody plugging in a thumb drive. So we have to work to get our devices that are going to be plugged into their PCs, like our cameras, et cetera, our Dante to USB converters, right, approved so that they can be used. And we don't want to find this out while we've got people on site trying to install it. We want to know this as early as possible.
Sounds like these are reasons why we're calling it a partnership.
Correct, exactly.
So let's keep rolling here. Paul, recent news examples. We've seen things about data breaches, about what we're calling bad actors. What have you seen in the news recently?
Yeah, so this one you got on your screen here, this hit the headlines just a couple of months ago. So it's a great example of a corporate bad actor. And the corporates involved here, there's actually three. I mean, there's Zoom itself, there's Apple, and there's Facebook. So what happened? Well, Zoom were caught not meeting users' security or privacy expectations. They weren't clear. They didn't tell the users what they were doing. And what they were doing was they were selling the metadata that we talked about before. That's who's calling who, how often, for what duration. They were selling that information to, guess who? Apple and Facebook. Apple and Facebook are two huge companies we probably all use, and we know they know the value of data. We don't know what they were doing with the data. We don't know how much money changed hands, but we do know that if Apple and Facebook think that that data would be of relevance to them or help them, then they know what they're doing. And so I think that's a great example of the corporate being a bad actor. The second one was the routing information through different countries. So that metadata was actually held in servers in China. And that, again, didn't meet the user's privacy expectations. They were expecting, if they were having a call between Boston, say, and Los Angeles, that all their metadata would be held in a Zoom server in the US. And
so should I be upset with Zoom because of these things or not?
Well, yes, we should be, but Zoom have taken steps to change that. They didn't do anything illegal. It's very important here. They just failed to meet up to users' expectations. How they respond to this will then dictate how angry people get with them.
That makes sense. So on the lower level end of things, we have Zoom bombing. Why don't you tell me about that?
Yeah, Zoom bombing is a classic example of low-level hackers or people who just want to do it for kicks and giggles and just disrupt the user experience. So these are people who are getting hold of the meeting ID numbers. Either they can run programs to fish for them, or more often than not, because a lot of it was university and education based, people were sharing links and sending it to people who weren't meant to be on the call, and that enabled these bad actors with time on their hands just to come in to the to the calls. And if they're able to do that, the chances are that the people who are setting up the meetings hadn't set some very basic privacy settings. So this is very easy to solve, just with some passwords and some waiting rooms. But if links are getting passed around and not being made secure, the chances are the video conference itself hasn't been set up correctly.
That makes sense. So we've talked about passwords a couple times throughout this conversation here. So there's going to be a balance, right, between security and making it easy for me to get my meetings started. Brian, what are your recommendations?
So it really been, like we've been talking about, it is a balance here, right? As we've seen with Zoom bombing and other things, there are a couple easy things that we can do, which might make things just a little less convenient, but they are a huge increase in security. Like when I'm setting up my meeting, just adding a password to that, right? It doesn't need to be anything crazy, but it's just an extra layer of security there. Waiting rooms are really key, right? And that doesn't mean that I have to apply a waiting room to every single meeting, right? If I'm having a meeting between myself and another coworker, I probably don't mind as much. But if I am having a large town hall, if I'm having a large student lecture, I may want to actually use the waiting room feature so that I know, hey, I'm about to admit student A or student B, and I'm going to bring them in. Takes a few extra minutes, absolutely, but it does help secure that environment. Never, ever, ever use your personal meeting ID. Different meeting ID every single time will really help make sure that if you do forget to set a password on a meeting and somebody can just hop right into every single, or not every single, but a lot of your personal meetings. So make sure to change that setting. And obviously, right, trying to balance this out with still making things quick, right? So hence why a lot of people don't do these things. And I think one real important part to talk about here is that everybody was thrust into this environment so quickly, with a lack of training, with a lack of understanding and knowledge of this, then that's really kind of where a lot of this stemmed from. So getting back to training our users, making sure that they have the tools that they need to succeed.
Sounds like life was suddenly different for a lot of people, not necessarily in the corporate environment, but if I'm the mayor running a town council meeting, I've never used any type of conferencing platform before. How would I know that there's passwords? How would I know that I can remove people from a meeting if they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing? And I think you said it, training.
Yeah,
And that's gonna be our starting point.
absolutely, right. As a professor, I might have just been only really used to in-person lectures, right? So I can see who's physically coming and going from the room. I can see, if a student's being a bad actor in person. So, and I know who that is. So it's a huge difference in environment now.
Yeah. So let's talk about a few general best practices regardless of the platform. Paul, could you give us the highlights?
Sure. So it's important to note that these do's and don'ts are the same across all platforms. In some platforms, there might be default on, and then some platforms might be default off. But something like each one of these items will be listed on all platforms. So let's start with the do's. Do try and use end-to-end encryption platforms. Now, there's not that many out there. There will be more coming. I think it will be surprise most people that our favorites probably aren't end-to-end encrypted. There are some out there, Blue Jeans and Starleaf, for example, which are, but most people in the corporate world probably aren't using those. Use waiting room features, as Brian said. That would stop Zoom bombing right there. People just wouldn't be able to get in to the meeting. Enable password protection. Social engineering. Now, be mindful of social engineering. This is an interesting one.
What is
this
that?
is what. Yeah. So this is really coming during COVID-19, as in most people now work from home. Where possible, use a virtual background. And that's because if you're at home, if you're in a home office, you could have pictures, wedding pictures, you can have educational certificates in the background that bad actors would be able to take a freeze frame photo of and perhaps later use to, I don't know, for identity theft purposes or for other reasons. So always try and use a virtual background where possible. Look, always update and use the latest version of the software. We do this with our apps on our phones. We do this with our PCs. Video conferencing applications is no different. They will include the latest security patches. But also do eject participants. If you don't know who they are in your meeting, get rid of them. Some people, especially when they're Zoom bombing, will change their Zoom ID to something generic like iPhone 2 or something like that, and not have their proper name on there, or they'll have some fake name. If you don't know who they are, if they shouldn't be in your meeting, get rid of them. Another real good feature that you can do, most platforms can do it, is lock the meeting. Once people are in that meeting, lock it so no one can join. Do educate your employees. That's the biggest one. Train people. It's the human factor. My 7-year-old now has to do Zoom calls for his school. He's had no training, and I reckon the teacher probably hasn't had much more.
He probably does it better than the rest of us as a 7-year-old.
Exactly. Yeah. So the don'ts. Don't use consumer grade software. The WhatsApps, the WeChats, they're part of big companies like we've just seen in Google and Facebook. They want your data. They're using their video conferencing and their chat applications really to push their other businesses.
So I'd imagine that because some of them claim heavy duty encryption, that the data that you're talking about may be more about metadata.
Yes.
Wouldn't be encrypted whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. They have your information, and I'm sure somewhere in the terms and conditions, you're actually giving them everything as well. So, so for our daily sort of enterprise or corporate business, don't use them. Don't share links. We're all guilty of it, but I think that's an obvious. There's an obvious security risk there. We can all understand. The more people who has that link is able to come into your meeting, and do not under any circumstances allow participants to share their screen by default. That's what was happening in Zoom bombing. Normally, when people come into the meeting and immediately start sharing their screen and be showing some obscene material or something else. Just don't do that. There'll be a setting in the settings, switch it off.
So it seems like we've said the word Zoom a lot in our conversation here this morning. And Brian, what are the topics here that we haven't hit yet that relate to the specifics of what I should do to make my Zoom call more secure? And I will preface this by saying that, we've been using Zoom for close to 2 years now internally and for our external calls. And personally, I have not really followed what would be the best practices for securing my own calls where I am the host. And yet I still have not had a single security breach or an issue or a bad actor or someone coming into my meeting to disturb things. But what's left here on the list?
Yeah, so I think the big ones, right, that we haven't really talked about are simple, right? Like muting participants upon entry so that you don't get interrupted, even if it's not somebody who is a bad actor per se. But in the background right now, my daughter could run in the room and all of a sudden I've got to be like, get out, and I'm interrupting my meeting. So things like that, a sound when somebody joins, that can be very helpful to know that somebody else has joined. Hey, I'm 25 minutes into the class. Why did somebody join? Now, it could be somebody who just dropped, or it could be that bad actor trying to come in here. And Paul already hit on this, but I really want to reiterate it, is passwords, right? It just adds that extra layer of security so that it is there. In case I did use my personal meeting ID by accident, you still have to have that extra layer of security there. Just a couple other pieces here. The join before host. Again, I have to think about what type of meeting it is. Is this, a quick catch up with my team? Is it, hey, it's the end of the week, Friday at 5:30. I want to have a happy hour with my team. That's fantastic. I don't necessarily need to worry about people joining before I get a chance to join. But if I'm having a town hall, if I'm having a director's meeting, if I'm having an HR meeting, I do want to make sure that I think about those settings there.
I'm on board with you there, and I prefer to leave it on in terms of allowing people to join before host. But the important part to note is that there's no one controlling that meeting if something does start to go downhill.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a case there too. Some people are like, well, what if I can't host? Right? You can, in most platforms, designate a co-host. Right? So if I do have an important meeting and maybe I get called away for something or my computer crashes, there can be a co-host, so that meeting can continue. Right? Yeah. So that just kind of helps to alleviate that concern.
So I'm going to move on here. When it comes to Microsoft Teams is extremely popular. What's your perspective on security when it comes to Teams?
Well, Teams is a bit of a different ballgame here, right? Microsoft controls most of the software that we use. They have a lot of influence there, but Teams is part of an entire universal collaboration environment, right? They have integrated it to every piece of it. So part of that integration is integrating with Active Directory and being secure right from the get-go, right? It does make things sometimes a little bit more complicated and a little bit less on the ease of use, but their settings are out of the box are secure. If you just even look at a simple example of a meeting invite, right? When I send out a meeting invite, a lot of the different providers have the meeting ID right in there, shown in plain text. There's also a link. By default, when you create a Teams invite, it's click here to join my meeting. Mm-hmm. The meeting invite is buried within that. So if somebody were to glance at my screen, they're not going to get that information. If I was sharing my screen and somebody was recording the other end and that popped up, they wouldn't get that information. They wouldn't have it. So it's the little things like that that Microsoft and specifically the Teams platform has really, excuse me, developed right from the get-go to ensure that they are a secure platform.
I think I'd correlate some of that to the ease of use versus security, in the sense that if the meeting invite for my Teams call doesn't have, say, a dial-in from my phone, I don't know how to dial in from the car. Not that I'm driving anywhere nowadays, but traditionally in the past, I've been in the car on calls all the time, and Zoom made it extremely easy for me to just jump straight in.
Yeah, they have that one-touch clickable link that automatically dials. I find myself personally now a lot using the apps on my phone, right? So that the Teams app would just launch and bring me in. That does obviously introduce another piece though to be careful about. Paying attention to the links, making sure that the link is actually it and not a piece of social engineering where somebody's trying to fake a meeting invite, etc. So just that extra just thought process and looking at it. The other piece there about Teams, which is really nice, which is available in the other platforms, but really in Teams by default, integrating with Active Directory, integrating with those different pieces of either on-prem or O365, allows your IT department to have more control there as well. So instead of having to send out some instructions to users of, hey, we want to change these security settings, do X, Y, Z, the IT department can deploy that a lot simpler to help make that easier, make sure those are more secure.
That all makes perfect sense. So I think we're about to the end here. And Bill, I wanted to ask you if there's any questions that have come in that we could help to answer.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Before we get started with the Q&A, just a quick reminder for everybody attending that you can use the Q&A button to ask additional questions throughout this part of the session. One question that came in that I can answer, may I have a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. We're going to include that with a link to the recording for all the attendees. To get this started, I wanted to ask a question of the three of you that I've heard recently from a few of our clients. Earlier in the presentation, Paul was giving us a lot of great information on the types of encryption, but what platforms really have end-to-end encryption?
So I can take that one there. So, I mean, we mentioned earlier, but BlueJeans and Starleaf really are the ones. One of the things to pay attention to there is a lot of different providers will advertise end-to-end encryption, but you need to pay attention to that. It is kind of hard to sort out at the moment because you have the engineers that wrote all the software and are dealing with all the back-end servers, etc. But then you get the marketing department involved, and they like to add some fluff and some key buzzwords there. So you do have to be careful, do your research, and make sure that you are getting a platform that meets your security needs with encryption and all the settings that you need.
And to add a little bit more detail, Paul mentioned before that Cisco WebEx meeting has encryption defaulted off, but you can enable it for end-to-end. Like, and this is real, according to what Cisco, and we have to just trust at this point. And encrypt for a meeting up to 100 participants. And once you go beyond that, you can't do it. And it's simply because end-to-end encryption, true end-to-end, is so complicated from an algorithm perspective in terms of creating the keys and sharing and distributing those keys to the endpoints. And then right now, today, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and Google Meet are all pretty similar in terms of they're encrypted from my laptop, my phone, and then they are decrypted up in the cloud, re-encrypted up in the cloud, and then decrypted on your cell phone, on your laptop, if you're the other participant in my call. And part of the reason for that is that without the decrypting, and it doesn't mean they're stealing your data, it means they might, or potentially have that opportunity, but if they don't unencrypt it up in the cloud, we lose some of the functionality that we expect today, in the sense of, oh, it knows Ben's talking, I'm going to maximize Ben's camera, and then it's Brian's turn to talk. If they're not doing some level of smarts behind the scenes, you lose that functionality. So if all you want is gallery view, great. It might be easier to achieve that.
Absolutely. And I think another thing to pay attention to there, Ben, is your provider's infrastructure, right? Microsoft, for example, because we've been talking about them, their Azure cloud infrastructure is massive, and they have tons of security protocols in place. As where if you're looking at something more of a startup, they probably don't have the resources to do as much of that. So that's an organizational decision as well.
So that's a great point. So we trust Microsoft with all our emails and a lot, 365 and a whole bunch of other information on a daily basis. Why wouldn't we trust them with our video conferencing, even though they don't have full layer 7 end-to-end encryption yet on Teams? Why would we trust Starleaf, which is a small startup from Cambridge, England, which is doing incredibly well on the market, but who's to say they haven't got a bad actor within their employees, which would have been rooted out via the Microsoft security policies that they have. So the question was secure platforms where you can use Cisco if you change the settings. And at the moment, BlueJeans and Starleaf are really the only two soft codecs in the market at the moment, but more will be coming.
Another question that came in during your discussion there is, do you still need to set up firewall settings, firewall transversal with cloud applications? Question.
So that's a really good question there. Part of the benefit of the cloud-hosted solutions really has been our connection is outbound, right? Instead of having to try to traverse inbound. Inbound is really where that comes into play. Outbound as well, because you can block certain things. But the secure streaming protocols, secure HTTP, those really don't require a lot of firewall rules set up, which is, again, a convenience factor. Helps the IT team, helps us. There are some scenarios where there are some different ports that need to be opened, but most of the big players, there's nothing you have to do so long as you have your general security set up, which again has made the cloud-hosted solutions so attractive. Is there's not a whole lot of configuration that needs to be done on the networking side of things. Yeah,
because they're using TCP/IP rather than UDP, which is blocked by firewalls. You shouldn't have to have too many settings in the firewalls using the common platforms.
Yep.
What's next, Bill?
I think this one came in earlier. Are you saying that I shouldn't use Zoom?
Well, I'm using Zoom. We're using Zoom right now for this webinar, and I plan to continue using Zoom.
Exactly, right. Zoom can be a great platform, and it is a great platform. It is, again, a matter of training. It is a matter of, let's change those default security settings so that I am putting in meeting passwords, so that I am enabling a waiting room. So Zoom can be a great tool, and it is a great tool. There's just a couple things that we need to configure in it to help make sure it is more secure.
And I would add that you should absolutely continue to use Zoom. Zoom has had some bad press in the last few months, but as a result, they are throwing a ton of money of trying to do something that other people have failed to do, and that they've just hired the best cryptographers in the world, security experts, and they are determined to fix this end-to-end encryption problem by trying to reduce the amount of bandwidth that is required in order to do it. They've got mathematicians on board, they have cryptographers and security experts. So Zoom is a huge commercial enterprise. They're throwing money at it. They know that they have failed in people's expectations. And as a commercial enterprise, they know that they live or die in the next 6, well, they won't die, but that they have to restore some of that faith. And they're actually working harder on end-to-end encryption and improving their product than, say, other bigger players. So Zoom is going to continue to innovate, and the security lapses that have been exposed will actually probably end up being a good thing.
I think you just answered one of the questions that just popped in. What should I say when our customers say they are no longer using Zoom? Anything you would add?
I think the platform that you use is very much based on the types of meeting and the types of communication that you're going to have. So like, we're using Zoom as a platform for this webinar because it works well. And if I had a different use case, it would be different. So it's all based on the type of communication. There's plenty of corporate organizations out there that use multiple platforms, and they have different use cases for the platforms that they are using. What were you going to say, Paul?
Yeah, I was going to say something roughly the same kind of lines. It's about functionality, and Zoom has done well because people have liked the functionality, and that's not going to go away. So unless the more traditional companies start adding in the functionality, then it's supply and demand, and I keep using it.
Cole had a really good point where he was saying that Zoom went out and hired a bunch of security experts, and Zoom potentially could pull ahead of other major platforms in the coming months in terms of security.
Their intention is certainly to do that.
I really like this next one because I know that we had some issues when we first rolled Zoom out within our organization. Do soft codecs use QoS to ensure bandwidth? Is bandwidth an issue?
So absolutely. QoS is used, it's generally more at the network layer, right? But most of the conferencing platforms will prioritize audio over video, right? I certainly would enjoy seeing you guys, especially now that I'm stuck at home. I don't get to see you very often. But more importantly, generally you want to see or you want to hear what I'm saying. So there are definitely settings within there. And that's also a lot up to your IT team and the way that they configure the network to ensure that that traffic is prioritized correctly. That was actually a lot more of an issue back in where everything was more a hard codec because of the amount of traffic required by it. The different algorithms, the different codecs that are being used as they develop further and further require less and less bandwidth. Obviously, the larger the call, the more bandwidth that's in use there. But the individual bandwidth requirement from home, from whether it be in the office, is not as large as it used to be. So it's not as big a deal as it used to be. But it is most certainly something to think about, right? If you're a smaller enterprise with not a huge connection, a huge pipe out to the internet, maybe at home I only have the basic connection, but even everybody with the basic connection at home really is having a pretty good experience there. Generally, the issues are more, my wife has been working from home, and sometimes there's some Wi-Fi issues. I have an access point that's down at the moment. So that's generally more the issue there.
So I would like to add about end-to-end encryption. And so that puts a lot of stress on the processor. So if you're using a phone and you're using a Blue Jeans app or something like that, you're going to find that your battery is going to, the quality of service might well be good, but you need at least a 1 megabyte, a 1 meg a second connection. And I hope you're on Wi-Fi rather than paying for the data plan there. But that will drain your battery just because of the processing power that it'll also be using as well. So yes, the quality of service is there, but the user experience, if you're using an application which uses end-to-end encryption, would be different, I would suspect, than if you're using one without, just simply because of the extra computational or requirement required to de-encrypt the signal.
And in terms of bandwidth versus quality, a quick example is when we first rolled out Zoom internally, and we hadn't been aware or didn't look for what Zoom now has is very good documentation for how to roll out in a corporate environment. But initially, Zoom was seeing our outbound traffic as one single IP address. And so if you had one call with 30 people on it, was fine. But if you had 30 concurrent calls in our office, we were having issues because it was throttling it down. So there are guidelines that Zoom and others make readily available that we can watch. And on the new Zoom, it says right now in terms of bandwidth, I'm pushing 1 meg out, and I'm only receiving 200 kilobits per second right now, and you guys all look great.
It's interesting. We're getting a couple great comments here about remembering doing video conferencing over ISDN. Come a long way from there. Couple comments on telemedicine applications requiring encryption for HIPAA along from a security standpoint. Anything you want to comment on that?
So telemedicine, I think, has actually been a big one. We've done a couple telemedicine visits with doctors, and a lot of the times you'll see that they're using not necessarily a proprietary platform, but a different platform than Zoom or Teams. They do have to be concerned about HIPAA laws. They do have to be concerned, as Paul mentioned before, about how the data flows, right? When you cross boundaries, just because the provider has a server outside of this country, you do have to be concerned about the privacy laws of that data. While it has been an adjustment and doing that, it is nice also that we can still stay in touch and talk to our doctor, even though we can't see, or even though we can't physically go into the office. But a lot of those platforms that they're using do take that into account because of HIPAA privacy laws.
And that there are platforms out there, not video conferencing platforms for enterprises that governments will use as well, and other industries will use for that encryption. But they're not the video conferencing apps that we would be using, say, in the verticals of, say, the banking sector or the legal sector. They are much more bespoke.
And I think we have time for one more question. Is there any additional security issues I should worry about if I'm working from home?
I do think there are definitely some things that we should worry about. One of the pieces Paul mentioned earlier would be the social engineering, right? In the background, you can see, my degree up on the wall in my office, or you can see pictures of my kids, right? And people using that somewhat to understand, or maybe be able to guess what my security questions might be if I need to reset my password. I think one of the other pieces in working from home too, as well, is while my kids aren't going to do anything on my computer maliciously, right? Forgetting to lock my computer, my daughter could come and play with a document, and all of a sudden, oh crap, all the notes I took over the last hour are gone because she deleted it. So that's just more of a funny example, I think. But there are definitely some things we need to take into consideration where we're storing our data in that scenario, right? That doesn't even have to do with the video conference or the collaboration side of things here. Is am I making sure that I'm still backing up appropriately to my company's infrastructure there? So if something were to happen to my machine here, that data is not lost.
Yeah. For me, it's about complacency. We're spending so much time on these platforms now that we tend to then take shortcuts. As we said on the first slide, there's no such thing as a secure shortcut. And I think we're all just getting video conferenced out at the moment, and hopefully soon we'll be back to face-to-face meetings where we'll go into a boardroom, and remember, we'll close the door because we want some privacy. We just have to metaphorically close the door on video conferencing sometimes, and as we use it more, we get complacent and we forget to do those things.
This is a little off topic, but it's been interesting how there's been social pressure within a call to turn your camera on for some of the individuals who would never have traditionally wanted to be on camera or anyone to see them. I sat on one where there was 12 people on the call, except one had the camera off, and they're all like saying, "You got to do it, just turn it on." And he said, "Well, I haven't shaved and I showered maybe 2 days ago."
Absolutely. I personally don't love seeing myself on camera, but especially now, it is nice to actually see people other than your immediate family at home that you've seen for the last 6 and 7 weeks.
But in terms of making sure your Wi-Fi connection is okay and stuff like that, it wouldn't matter. There's no security concerns there because it's done at the application or it's done at the transport layer of your machine.
There actually is one point I want to add there, actually. Paul, you bring up a really good point, right? In working from home, if you had your data here, making sure that your Wi-Fi password is actually a strong password. Don't make it 1234. Don't make it something along those lines, right? So somebody can jump on your home network. So, and that's even not in this environment, making sure that that somebody can't get on there. So just take a minute, make that a little more secure, whether it be that you have to authenticate whitelist machines or just making a really secure password there. I actually, about a year ago, had somebody hopping on my Wi-Fi just because my connection was better. And I then took to making my Wi-Fi password ridiculous, which is not fun to enter on devices, but I haven't had an issue since.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you, Paul, especially for staying up so late to join us tonight. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Ben. Really appreciate your time and insight. I also want to thank everybody for joining us today and hope you found this session valuable. Just a reminder, the recorded replay will be available in the next few days, and we'll share the recording and the presentation with you when we have it posted. If you do have any follow-up questions, or if you have a topic that you think we would want to consider for one of our future webinars, please feel free to email it directly to me at bchamberlin@verrex.com. That's BCHAMBERLIN@Verrex, VERREX.com. Or you can also just connect with any of us on LinkedIn. Again, thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you.